The handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley either suddenly disappeared without a trace or abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, but some very strange things started happening that were not folklore. These were horrifying, real events. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. And so after a very long and arduous journey, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. They're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. And right away, they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning, they do the same thing. And by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold, and then try to get out of there, and then, regroup and come back another time. They literally fashioned another boat, and they went back up to that site, and this time they didn't find any gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. They get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back and go get more gold. Charlie, the older brother, felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I'm actually not going to go. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation, and finally they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, they make their way up into the valley. They didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned. He figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term. And because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. Weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. But a whole other year would go by, and at this point Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people to head back into the Nahanni Valley. Charlie and his search party, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream, and then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through, and they're labeled Fourth Canyon, Third Canyon, Second Canyon, and First Canyon. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. You're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides to these massive cave systems. Nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker. These huge cliff walls obscure the sunlight. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. But as soon as they step foot on land, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And and right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. They go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body halfway in the tent, and there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body. And when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. They never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite. And in fact, he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree. And it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby, nothing. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. That's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. Pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. That stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. People, after the story broke, were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what, I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So, all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was, and he actually built a one-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley, and they actually found his cabin. Or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground. And laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths. The police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. People assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what, despite the rumors, let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley and they set up camp in Headless Valley. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river. And he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by and now John's past due. And so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area. And so this partner contacted him and the two of them went to the river and and began walking upstream until they found John. John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. But ultimately, he died because he froze to death, and so there's no foul play here. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point, they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp, and there's no sign of where she went. So the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police. Police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party, he was just in the vicinity, he overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. That night, when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he said at some point he went to bed, and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight, and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it, and then he hears it again, and he can tell it's off to his left. And so he's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away, a naked woman running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns, and he gets a good look at her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. And so universally it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. Police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she had already been gone for months, and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley, a man named Phil Powers. He finds a spot off of Flat River, he builds a cabin, and then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was just all one big accident, but the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, they entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. In fact, they were never found. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous, his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag laying down right along the Flat River. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribes people came into their camp, and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. All night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights, coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment, but other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.